Today's episode is sponsored by newspapers.com, the largest online newspaper archive. Newspapers.com makes it easy to find your family's story with more than 500 million digitized newspaper pages from the 1690s to today. Search for obituaries, marriage and birth announcements, photos, and more in papers from across the U.S., the U.K., Canada, and beyond, stretching back 3 centuries. For listeners of this podcast, newspapers.com is offering 20% off a Publisher Extra subscription. Just use the code Genealogy Adventure at checkout. That code is Genealogy Adventure for 20% off Publisher Extra.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Genealogy Adventures. I'm Brian Sheffy.
And I'm Danya Williams. How are you guys doing this dreary? I guess it's kind of bright outside, Sunday afternoon.
Well, it was bright. It's getting a little bit dreary over here, but we hope you're having a fantastic Sunday at home. And as always, thank you for spending the next hour with us.
Yes. We have a great show and on store for you guys today.
We do. You guys have asked for it, and you got it, more or less. So today we're going to be joined by Linford Sweeney, who's a Black history educator and author with over 15 years of experience in delivering courses, talks, and workshops. He also delivers commissions around history and heritage. Through his business, which is called Inspired Histories, he regularly presents to educational, public, private, and community organizations throughout the UK and abroad. And today we are going to be really focusing on the British-held islands in the Caribbean. So not the entirety of it, but the British-held islands. And without further ado, welcome to the show, Mr. Sweeney. We are so pleased to have you.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Because especially this season, and Donnie can back me up on this one, when we touch on the Caribbean, people are like, oh, you need to get someone to come onto the show to talk about it. And that's not necessarily the easiest thing to find, someone with that kind of experience. So we are just blessed that you're going to be with us today.
Yes, we are.
So to kind of start off, how did you get drawn into genealogy? I mean, as something to do, how did it really kind of suck you in?
Oh, it's all started with my mother. My mother has always taught me since I was probably in my teens. She always taught me about her family in terms of I knew her mother, but I didn't know her grandparents, and she told me about her grandparents, and she also told me about her 2 times great-grandfather, who was an enslaved man in Jamaica, who became free. So it all began about around when in the 1970s. And we just continued talking, and eventually she actually knew more about my father's side of the family also than my father did, and my father basically knew very little. So she was born where my father's family were from, so she got to know quite a lot about the family. So she told me about that. And then I went to see other family members, and they gave me the background. And since that, I've been researching the family.
Wow. Oh, well, that is awesome. And as we're specifically talking about the British-held islands in the Caribbean, can you just name what those islands were? Or, sorry, I should say, Can you name what those islands are?
Right. Hey, that's putting me on the spot, isn't it? Okay. We start off with Jamaica. And not far from Jamaica, we've got the Cayman Islands. After that, avoiding Cuba and Haiti and the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, We then move over into what we class as the small islands like Dominica. We have Antigua. I'm just trying to remember them. Antigua and Barbuda. We've got St. Lucia. We've got St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We've got Trinidad and Tobago. We've got Barbados. We have St. Lucia. We have St. Kitts and Nevis. Have I mentioned them? Montserrat. As you can see, there are quite a lot. Grenada, I think I've mentioned, Dominica, etc. Interspersed between those islands, we've got the Spanish-speaking islands like Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic. We've also got Martinique, and we've got Guadeloupe, Marie-Galante, etc. So as you can see, there are quite a lot of islands throughout the Caribbean. I've not even mentioned Turks and Caicos, the Bahamas, US Virgin Islands, the British Virgin Islands.
So it's a lot, in other words.
Yes, that's why it took me a while to start thinking about them.
And geographically speaking, it's a very wide spread out area. People think because it looks on a map like it's tiny. It really isn't.
It is quite, I mean, for instance, Barbados is quite a long way away from Jamaica, because Barbados actually, if some people realized, a lot of the other islands, and just one other thing, there is one country which is not an island, which is classed as Caribbean, and that's Guyana. So we must not forget Guyana. It was owned by the British originally, and so they're an anglicized island country, which is in South America, but is classed as part of the Caribbean group of countries. But as I say, Barbados is actually in the Atlantic, and it's actually quite a little bit of a way away from the rest of the Caribbean, but is classed as Caribbean. Also, some people also class Barbuda, not Barbuda, Bermuda. They class Bermuda as Caribbean. It's quite a long way away from the Caribbean, but sometimes it's actually brought into the Caribbean because it's all by itself somewhere off the coast of the United States. So it's quite several hundred miles between Trinidad, Tobago, Dominica, Grenada, Barbados, compared to, say, Jamaica. I mean, Jamaica's only 90 miles from Cuba.
Wow.
And just under 200 miles from Florida. Mm-hmm. So Jamaica's closer to those places than it is to a lot of the other islands.
And just to give our audience a bit of a timeline, at least to start with, when did the British in particular start settling islands in that region?
Right. The British first started settling in St. Kitts and Nevis, which is around 1823. And they started proper settlements around 1824. And then they took on Barbados and quite a few of the other islands around that area. Jamaica didn't come into the equation until 1655. And even in between all of that, the islands changed power. The power changed within the islands. For instance, St. Lucia at one point was French. Mm-hmm. Then it became British. Part of St. Kitts was also French. Then it became British. So was Dominic. So what I'm saying, there were many changes. And finally, Trinidad and Tobago did not become British until after the 1800s.
Okay, but when did they start introducing slavery to the islands?
Right. In terms of Jamaica, in terms of the Caribbean, enslaved people had been introduced by the Spanish from the early 1500s. It's as far back as that. In terms of the British started enslaving, carrying enslaved people across the Atlantic which was then called the transatlantic slave trade, that started in 1562. So the British came into it a bit late. The Spanish were already doing it, the Portuguese were doing it, the Dutch were doing it, and the French were doing it. So the British came into it late in 1562.
Wow.
Wow, I'm just processing that you said the word late and then 1562.
Well,
Right.
yeah, but when you think of 1505 to 1560, that's quite a long way. And then later on, in terms of bringing enslaved people by the way, when the British started in 1562, they used to actually sell those enslaved people to the Caribbean, but they weren't in the Caribbean at the time. They were trading. And they were also trading with Virginia, because as you know, Virginia was British at one time. So Virginia was one of the first places they started trading with, until they became, they took over some of the islands, and then those enslaved people came on the islands. Jamaica didn't have any enslaved people from Britain until 1655, when it became a British colony.
Because I'm actually in the process of researching the settlers of the Carolinas, as it was then known before it was split between North and South Carolina. People like the Middletons, other families like that who came from Bermuda, bringing their enslaved people with them into, not Bermuda, sorry, Barbados, my bad, Barbados, bringing their enslaved people with them to right into South Carolina. And there's been a long history of links between what's now the United States and the Caribbean, because you've got again, that connection with Florida. There's the long-standing Florida-Cuba connection, as well as other parts of the Caribbean. So I mean, it's a tricky history. There's a lot of dates. It's an old history. It's a lot for people to wrap their heads around. But in terms of researching our ancestry there, it's important. Because again, Donnie and I know that we have genetic links going all the way back to the earliest days of enslavement in colonial America with the Caribbean.
Right.
Yeah, as I said, there was obviously there was a strong link between the British and the Carolinas and Virginia at one point, and so many of their enslaved people were interchanged between those areas. Yeah, so it's no surprise.
Wow.
Okay, and before we get into your specific ancestry, because I know that you want to talk about that and use that as an example of the kind of records and information that people can find, just generally speaking, and this is just with the islands that you're familiar with, what types of records are available, and kind of what is their state of preservation? How many of them have been digitized?
Ooh, that's a good question. At the present moment, the only place that has been fully digitized is Jamaica. And basically, I can actually go into the Jamaican records. And for instance, we're lucky enough to have a familysearch.org, which is one of the places which is used quite a lot, and it's also free, which is, that's important. It's actually free, because many of them, like MyHeritage and Ancestry, you have to pay for to search those records. But we've got the Ancestry records are also literally the same as the family history, the family search records. They aren't that much different. I use both of those. MyHeritage also has a lot of family trees, which are linked to family search now, which means that you can search across different databases. The other thing about Jamaica particularly is there's also the Jamaica Gleaner, which was started in the 1830s in Jamaica. And it's possible to search all of the Jamaica Gleaner, the newspaper, right up to today, which is fascinating from the 1830s, before, literally around the same time as slavery was abolished. Because slavery was abolished in the British Caribbean in 1834.
Cool.
Okay.
And I'm going to cycle back to that in just a minute. I've got two questions, and then I know Donnie has questions for you as well. So before we get into when slavery ended and records that might be relevant to that, so in the United States, when slavery ended, there was, depending on what state it was, certain things were done to document newly freed enslaved people. So it could be things like cohabitation records, special marriage records, where you can learn more information about who enslaved these people. Sometimes the state even had a special census. They just did a special census to be able to document everyone in the state, not just single out newly freed enslaved people. So when Britain ended slavery, and again with the islands that you're familiar with, was there any special way that it captured information about the newly enslaved people in records?
Let's go back a little bit. During slavery, the only way, until 1814, approximately 1814, there were no records at all other than through wills, and through manumissions, which is people freeing enslaved people, like certain estates and certain people who may have had children with enslaved women, for instance. They would then free some of those children. There were no actual records as such. The only records you could find were mainly church records, which mainly dealt with baptisms. That was it, baptisms. And for instance, I've gone back into my family history, and the only reason that I found my 3 times great-grandfather was because he was baptized in 1826. And at the time, he was 33 at the time.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because I've been doing some research and doing Jamaican research, and that was one of the things that was actually kind of pushing it, the fact that there were baptismal records of these particular people. And that's how I was able to connect those families.
That's exactly it. Yeah. And as I said, you had the baptism. For instance, when an enslaved person passed away, there were no death records. If they got married, there were no marriage records unless they had property. They were free and had property, because at that time, Jamaica was run by the planters. The property owners ran Jamaica. So unless you had property, you would have no marriage records or death records. And very few Black Jamaicans actually had property at that time. Some did. And so we now come into after emancipation in 1838, for instance, in the British Caribbean. The records did not, 1812, 1814, 1314, the British then decided that all planters had to submit records, names of all their enslaved people every year. That was from 1814. And that's where we can now start to get the names of some of the people who were our ancestors. The problem was, at the time, some of them still had their African names, a few of them, which was just one name. And some of them actually had English names. My 3 times great-grandfather, I don't know what his African name was, but I knew he was African because it states that he was African, which meant he came over on a slave ship. Wow. But I don't know what he had an English name. So I've now got to trace back into the plantation owner's records, the plantation owner that actually had him as an enslaved person. But then if he had an African name, I wouldn't know whether it was him or not. And so the only way I could check that is if they gave the actual age. And some plantation owners were very good, and they actually gave ages and names. even before records were required. Now, coming after enslavement, those records didn't change, except that now, from 1838 onwards until approximately 1878, there literally were no records.
That's incredible.
Amazing. It is.
Very few records. There were some, but not many. I mean, there were the churches still had the existing records. Apart from the churches, literally, there were no records. So the churches were the only ones that kept those records.
So I'm curious, how were the sale of slaves handled? Were there deeds, and were those deeds filed any place?
No, they were basically they basically were put on an auction block and sold for money.
But there was no records kept of the actual sale.
No, I've not seen very many records of that, because remember, when they were selling them, they basically, many of them didn't even have names. They were given names once they went on the plantations.
So those that came over that carried the English names that you said, does that mean that they had surnames as well? Like, I'm Donya Williams. Did they have all of that?
Only the free ones would have surnames. In other words, what people are not aware of is that not all people that were all black people that came to the Caribbean were actually enslaved. There were small numbers that came to work in the Caribbean, and they weren't actually enslaved because they were skilled people. So it was a small number. And so at one point, I think around 1890s, there were something like around 5,000 enslaved, 5 or 6,000 free black people in Jamaica, for instance. The rest of them were all enslaved.
Okay, I am 56 years old, and I've just learned something new.
Yeah, I mean, it's always that's what we do.
Yep. So surnames really didn't come until later. The free ones got surnames, but the ones who were enslaved and became apprentices in 1834-35 and then got emancipated, it was when they became emancipated that many of those actually took surnames. Some took it just before they were became what they call apprentices, because in 1834 the act was passed in 1833 to abolish slavery. But the point is that they then decided to keep people on as apprentices, which is basically almost the same as being enslaved. But they brought them in, and so some of those, in order to keep records of their apprentices, because, as I said, the slave owners had to keep records of their apprentices. Many of them were given took surnames. Some were given it. Others took it from the slave owner. Some took it from places around them. Like some people would be called freeman. Rather than taking somebody's name, they'd call themselves freeman. Here's the other thing. Don't forget, at this time also, enslaved people, the vast majority, I'd say 95% of them, could not read or write. So even being given a name, they probably wouldn't even know what their names were unless somebody spoke it. Yeah. Wow. So it all became phonetic. It was all phonetic. It's what your name sounded like. And you'd go and tell somebody, this is what my name is.
See, now that's really sad.
Yeah, it is. And it's so funny because as you're talking, we have one person who's been asking questions, and every time as you're talking, you then answer Lacrissa's questions. Yeah. So I can't even get the opportunity to say, hey, we got this.
And then if we then, I'm not saying records didn't exist. There were records. I've been able to go back. But for instance, some of my great 2 times great grandparents, they passed away before, and when my great grandmother was only small, was only a child, and there are no death records at all for them,
Right.
because they were enslaved. And so it was only in 1878 that they instituted records. So now you've got death records, marriage records, and birth records. Yeah, because remember,
that's awesome.
Remember before that there were baptismal records. Look, sometimes you would have the actual birth along with the baptismal records. On many occasions you would have that. My great-grandmother was born in 1848, which was 10 years after emancipation and 12 years after slavery was abolished. And I went to Jamaica to the records office to look for her details and found it in a book. And in that book, it gave me when she was baptized, which was 1850. But right next to it, and I didn't see that against a lot of the other people's names, right next to it, it said the 3rd of December, 1848. That's when she was born.
Wow.
I have one more before I hand over to Danya. And we love to talk, but we love to teach too. And this is a consideration that I think is going to be very useful to people in our audience. So in the United States, obviously we have states that are subdivided into counties, or in the case of Louisiana, parishes. And then further subdivided, it could be further subdivisions like districts, beats, they're different kind of words. And then the boundaries changed all the time, which just causes havoc and nightmares for researchers. How was the British-held territories, how were those islands, I guess, divided up administratively? I mean, what would be the equivalent there?
They were divided up into parishes, which is similar to counties. Yeah.
Okay.
So they were divided up into parishes, and each parish had its own capital. Yeah, or its own main city, or main town, sorry, because there aren't that many cities in, for instance, Jamaica. Normally in most of these smaller countries, the cities are quite small. But in Jamaica, we had Kingston. But here's the interesting thing about Jamaican parishes. There were I think there were 5 original parishes. And then as time went by, right up to 1866, Jamaica ended up with 22 parishes. Remember, this is a small country, and it had 22 parishes. So in 1866, they changed all of that, and they took a bit. They got rid of 8 parishes. No, 10 parishes actually. No, it's 8. It is 8. I'm getting confused now. They got, well, put it this way, it went from 22 parishes right down to 14 parishes. So that's 8 parishes. Yeah, they got rid of. And some of those parishes were, they were amalgamated into other larger parishes. Yeah. So now Jamaica has 14 parishes, including Kingston, the capital. Okay. And so that's how it's administered now. You've got parish, you've got the prime minister and the government, etc. And you've got each parish have their various MPs, and each area has councillors also. Yeah. In other words, these are people who would be responsible for a district within the area. I think I'm getting this right, because I don't really know the politics of the islands that are there separated. But where I'm from, in a place called Clarendon in Jamaica, it's divided up into Southern Clarendon, Central Clarendon, and Northern Clarendon. And that is further divided for voting purposes. Yeah, so it can be quite. As I say, there are 3 million people on the island of Jamaica, and if you divide that by 14, well, actually, no, it wouldn't be correct, because Kingston has about 800,000 people by itself. But as I said, it is 14 parishes, and each parish have their own parish management teams, etc.
So it
So I
sounds
don't know
more
whether
like
that
the
answers.
states. It sounds more like how our states are, their
It
parishes are
is.
very similar
Yeah.
to how our states are set up, because we have each state has a capital.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what it sounds like. The parishes are set up in that way, where each parish has a quote unquote capital.
Yeah, I think it's more. I think it's more. It's a lot more than that, in the sense that, to me personally, a state in the United States to me is like a country in its own right. That's how I see it. And within each state, they have counties. Am I right?
Yes.
Well, that to me is a bit like Jamaica. It's like you've got the Florida, and you've got counties within Florida. I don't know what they're all called, but you've got various counties, and each county is managed, but has their own is managed by their own, town manager or whatever. Yeah. The only difference is that they don't have individual police forces in our parishes. There is a police force for the whole of Jamaica. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, I'm also presuming that if someone wanted to research the changes in parishes and boundaries, that there are going to be things like maps and books that they can access to
Yeah.
find out more.
And one of the good things is that somebody, a woman who lived in the States, decided some years ago to set up a website called Jamaican Family Search. And that website has the most detailed information about Jamaica, including its history, the names of the landowners, the slave owners,
Oh, wow.
enslaved people's manumissions, information about the Maroons. It is an absolutely wonderful site. She used to charge for it. Now it's free. Yeah.
Is that .com.org?
It's JamaicanFamilySearch.com. It's all one, JamaicanFamilySearch.com. You go in there and there's so much information. You just put in what information you want, put in the name of a person, etc., and it will bring up a whole lot of information. Plus, it teaches you a lot about the parishes. It teaches you about the history of Jamaica. It is a wonderful site for doing research for my purposes, except that it doesn't have detailed research as detailed research as, say, FamilySearch.org.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing that impressed Danya to no end, and it impressed me, but she saw it first, was the fact that you were able to research your family back to the 1600s. And I know Danya had a lot she wants to say about that.
Do you want to put up my number one on my? Would you be able to do that?
Yeah. Which one is that?
Number one, the first one. It's got number one, and
I had to label it differently. So
it's the family tree basically.
Okay.
It says my family tree. There we are. That's a bit small, but I think we can manage to see a little bit of that. And as you can see, at the bottom of that family tree, that's my mother. Yeah.
Wow.
And then you've got my grandmother, her father, who was Joseph Craig. His mother was called Caroline Messam. Yeah, as you can see, I can't go any further with John Craig. John Craig was the African that I told you about that came over on a ship. But I can't go any further back than the fact that if I do go further back, it's through my DNA. And I found out that I'm 63% West African, of which much of that is Nigerian. So there's a possibility he's either Yoruba, Igbo, or one of those nations in groups in Africa.
Yeah.
Yep. The Yoruba speaking people, the Igbo people, etc. So I then followed his son's wife's line, and then found out her father was called Joseph Messam, and he was born approximately 1820.
Got it.
His father was also called Joseph, so I call them Joseph the First and Joseph the Second. So Joseph the First is, so we're now looking at my 1, 2, 3, 4. That's my 4 times great grandfather was Joseph Messam. His father was called Milborough Messam. And I've got his children as well, you know, the names of the children. And then his father was called William Messam. And I found his details and found out he was born in approximately 1755. These are approximate birth dates because, as I said, it was mainly baptismal dates. So he was baptized in 1755. And he had children with a woman called Millie. Now he was classed as a free Negro. That's the terminology they use, a free Negro. I haven't got any information about his father, who was born in 1722, but there's a possibility he was what they call a mixed heritage person. In other words, his father, Robert Messam, would have been either Welsh or English. I've checked the name Messam, and it does come from Wales, but it's also in England. And so that's as far back as I've been able to go so far. However, I have recently looked at somebody else's genealogy, and I've been able to, wait for it, go back to the 1600s, the 1500s, the 1400s, and even further back. Yeah.
Wow.
Oh, yes. Somebody's just said the Jamaica Almanac is a good one also. Yeah, that's very true. That's something else we can use, the Jamaican Almanac, because they've got lots of records there. So I then found out that this person, ancestor was King James I of Scotland. Isn't that interesting? And
yes,
then they also went back to Robert the Bruce of Scotland. And they actually went back further, right through to 800 AD. Because the good thing about records, if you have a property and you've got a title, your records will be there. If you don't have land and the property, forget it. You know, people, you just have to, you know, look at the surname and wonder whether maybe this person in the 1500s was related to me, but there's no guarantee. But if you're landed, if you have property and you've got a title like a sir or a lord or a baron or a baronet, etc., you have no problem.
And those British lineage books are awesome. So I didn't expect to meet another cousin today, because through my white enslaving Henry ancestors, I also descend from the Royal Stuarts and the Bruce family as well. So hello, cousin.
Can I say something also to you? Something important. In the 1600s. Many Irish and Scottish people were transported to America and to the Caribbean. Also in the 1700s, mid 1700s, you may have heard of his name's gone out of my head. Bonnie Prince Charlie. He was fighting against the British to get the throne back. And he was Scottish because he believed that the English took away the throne should have gone to a Scottish king and not to an English king. Yeah. So as a result, they had a war. They had a group of people who called themselves the Jacobites. And the Jacobites fought against the British and they lost. And Bonnie Prince Charlie also lost. So he ended up back in France, because the French didn't back him. So therefore, what they did is all of those people, which included black people, by the way, there were not quite a number of black people living in Scotland. And there's also a lot of history about the history of Britain, because up to now, about 9,100 BC, They found an intact skeleton called Cheddarman, and they've done a reconstruction and found out that he had dark skin.
Wow.
And he was
So
British. But the Jacobites were all transported to the Caribbean. And so many of those Jacobites were supporters of the king, or they were related to the royal line of Scotland. And that's why those royal lines are in the Americas and the Caribbean.
Wow. So how does, and I know I told you we would talk about this a little bit and in the green room, how does Australia come in? Because I know in the research that I've done, there is, Australian heritage as well, or lineage as well, that connects.
Because a lot of the all right, let's look at America, for instance. America, quite a large percentage of Irish people left Ireland and went to what is now the United States. Yeah. Quite a large percentage of Europeans in general left, and particularly British, left to live in the United States. Yeah. And so that's why you've got so many Irish and Scottish, as somebody's saying, Irish and Scottish ancestors. Also, a lot of the people that were sent to Australia were also Irish and Scottish.
Okay.
So they were related. So many of those were already related. So if you go back maybe quite, let's say, maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 generations, you will find that there is a link between those people and the people in America and the people in Australia and the people in Britain and the Caribbean.
Yes, and what I always find interesting is the history books and history teachers don't go on to say that these people who went to the Caribbean and what would become the United States, they fathered mixed race children, because the Irish and the Scottish just get blown away when they actually realize, oh my God, I've got family, Black family members in the United States, Canada, Caribbean, pretty much everywhere the British went, that they have relatives who don't look like them.
Right.
Well, part of that had to do with the fact that many of the people who traveled in the 1600s and the 1700s to the Americas and Caribbean, many of those people, and also in the 1800s, the vast majority of those people were men. Think about it. There were men. In the Caribbean, I believe around 70 or 80%, maybe around 80 to 85%. Don't quote me on this, but there was a large percentage that didn't bring their wives or brought a woman to the Caribbean. And so many of them actually ended up with Black women. Some had them as mistresses, some basically forced themselves on them, and others actually married them.
Now, I've got a quick question for you, staying on this topic. So we're talking about the men. At least here in the American colonies, we also had indentured servants who were women. And no one knows the percentage, but there were white women who were indentured servants who had children by enslaved men or free men of color. Are there any documented incidences of that happening in the Caribbean?
Well, what actually happened, I remember reading something about Virginia. At one point, there were so many white women having children with Black men that they passed a law to stop it happening. Think about it. They passed a law
They did that here too.
That's what I'm saying. This was in Virginia that I read this, but I think the same thing happened across the Caribbean. Yep.
Wow. Well, I have one person that has a question, and it kind of goes back to when you were talking about the records, which I thought was fascinating in itself. You said that they started to record people by 1870, which
1878.
1878.
Yeah.
Well, this person actually asked the question. She said, So Carol Henry said, so do they have records for people who work on ships during the early 1900s?
People who worked on ships. Are we talking about black people?
More than likely, yes.
Right. In terms of records, you'd have to go to the mercantile, the shipping companies or something like that. I know there are records about people in the 1900s, but the main thing is that if you were born like if you put up one of the next, there's a lady, there's my great aunt. Yeah, right. This is my great aunt and her son. Yeah, she was born in 1882.
She's beautiful.
This was taken in the 1850s, just before she passed away. She was in her 70s then.
You mean the 1950s?
1950s she died.
Okay.
Did I say 1850s?
Yeah.
Oh gosh, I don't think that would. There's a bit of time travel going on there. No, she was born 1882. She was the oldest surviving child of my great grandfather, who was a full Portuguese, and he married a black woman. Okay, which is why they're all mixed heritage, as you can see, from their looks, you see. So, yeah. As I said, she was born 1882. I've got her birth record. I've got her marriage record. And I've got her death record. That's the difference from 1878 compared to before 1878. I've got all those records. It's the same with my grandmother. I've got all those records also. Also, I've got the names of all her children. That woman, my great grandmother, who is not that lady, that was her mother. She had 11 children with this Portuguese man, and they lived together, got married after the 10th child, and 3 of them passed away at birth as infants. The other 8 all survived, and they're now buried together in Jamaica. They died 1925 and 1926, buried together. And what I'm saying is, I've got all those records. I've got the names of all their children, and I can now trace the family, the descendants of those children. But you couldn't have done that before 1878 with ease.
I have a quick question about a resource. So the British National Library has an awesome subset of records called its Colonial Collection. Yeah. And I found some documents in that collection dealing with the Americas that I have never found anywhere else. Do they also have records about the Caribbean?
Yeah, you'd have to go to the National Archives for that. I don't know whether you've heard of the National Archives that we have in Britain.
I have,
the National Archives have records of enslaved people, lots of records. And that's where a lot of people do their research, going back further than, during the time of enslavement, because that's when a lot of the wills were deposited, and people mentioned that people in the wills in terms of getting monies when somebody died, or getting their freedom, etc. But it also has records of the plantation owners and who they actually had on their plantations.
Okay. So then I have another question from Caribbean Newsroom. Where can I find records of my family who left Jamaica to Costa Rica, then Panama?
Ooh. Interesting. It's interesting that quite a lot of people from Jamaica voluntarily left Jamaica to go to Panama in the mid to late 1800s to the early 1900s. First to build the railways, and later on to build the Panama Canal. And quite a lot of Jamaicans came back to Jamaica, but many stayed in Panama. And so there's a very strong link between Panama at the moment and Jamaica. So there are records. You can actually get some of those records in Panama. I've been able to get some of those records on Family Search. Obviously, with Costa Rica now, Costa Rica is Spanish, isn't it? Spanish speaking.
I think it is, yes.
Yeah, so therefore, I haven't been able to have any links with that. The other place they went to was Belize. Yeah, so Belize has a strong link with Jamaica also, and with the rest of the Caribbean. So Panama and Belize have strong links with the rest of the Caribbean, but I'm not certain about Costa Rica. I'm not actually found any research relating to Costa Rica.
Okay. All right. You are. I don't know about Brian, but my mind is just.
Well,
I know where I need to do.
Now, talking again about the records that are held. So again, in the United States, I guess I kind of want to call them gatekeepers, or people who are responsible for making sure that a collection of records is kept safe and can make them publicly accessible. So we have people like county clerks, various research and historical societies, research libraries, parish clerks, who, within like Bermuda and Barbados and Jamaica, who would be those gatekeepers?
In Jamaica, we've got a place called the RGD, yeah, which is the Registrar General's Department. Yeah, the RGD, we call it RGD. It's in Jamaica, and within the RGD, they're online also. There's a genealogical records office. They're actually online on the government website, but they haven't digitized their records, so it's not possible to get. But luckily, we've got most of those records digitized on Family Search and Ancestry at the moment. But that's where in Jamaica you will find most of the records, and in Kingston they also have records, and you can go to quite a number of the different parishes and they will draw up those records. Like if I want a birth certificate, I went to get a birth certificate for myself in Clarendon. I just went to the records, the records office in Clarendon. They looked it up on the computer, found the details, and a week later, I came back and got my certificates. Yeah, so it's a lot easier now. I wouldn't say it's as easy as America, because in the States they've got a lot of people doing the research. In Jamaica, it's a small number of people who are doing that kind of research. Yeah, but then again, it is a smaller place.
So how difficult or how easy is it for someone, say Donnie and I wanted to have hire someone to find a record for us or to do a lookup, whether that's the administrative office or a genealogist that's on the ground. How easy or difficult is that to do?
It's not too difficult, because they will carry out research for you for approximately, let me see, what's that in dollars? Maybe around $12 an hour.
Really?
Yep.
Wow.
12, approximately. It's 1,500 Jamaican dollars, so it's approximately 12. It's about £8 an hour in Britain, so it's approximately about $12, $11 to $12 per hour. But what they can do in an hour, because genealogy, it doesn't take sometimes it takes me an hour it takes me a whole day just to find one record.
Right.
Whilst other times in an hour I can find 10 records. It all depends on who you're researching and how easy it is to actually find the records for those people.
No, we get it. We definitely get that.
Can I also show you some more of those records? Can you just
you got a few minutes. Which one you want me to pull up?
No, I was just going to show you what some of the records look like from way back. This one is whose record is this? This is the marriage of my great grandfather and great grandmother. My great grandfather was Portuguese. they got married in 1900, and this is the way the registration document, this is what it would look like. So this is, obviously, we didn't have this kind of record before 1878, but after 1878, they started to introduce records like that. And if you put the other one, the final one on, I'll show you what the records look like from way back. And what I'll be showing you is William's record. This is how the records look. And it was a book. And in that book, they'd write down all the baptisms that took place in that particular parish. Yeah. And this is my 6 times great grandfather's records. Yeah. Wow. Five times great grandfather. He's around somewhere. I can't remember. Oh yeah. No, that's Margaret. He's around somewhere, but I can't remember exactly where, but he's on this list. Yeah. He's on that list. And they had large books, and these books actually were what they wrote in, all the baptismal records, and all of these were kept mainly by the churches. The other thing to remember is for the other islands in the Caribbean, the majority of the actual records are kept by the churches. But many of those countries now have what they call records offices. For instance, Bahamas. In the Bahamas, they have a records office that you could get in touch with, or it's via through their public library service. You would be able to find those records. If you go to Dominica, for instance, against the public library service, and they also have a Register General who keeps those records. So again, you can still get in touch with these people. You can ring them or email them, and they may be able to do your research for you. But in many cases, people have actually gone across to these places and undertook the research themselves.
Mm-hmm. And if you can do this in about 2 minutes, because we're kind of coming to the end of the show, apart from hurricanes, earthquakes, natural disasters, what has the level of record destruction been like?
That's what
there are quite a lot of records that were kept in Kingston in the 1800s when there was a fire in the records in Kingston, and that destroyed some of the records. So that's why sometimes it's not possible to find all the records. Sometimes you do find the records, but you can see where they've been burnt or they've had water damage or something because of hurricanes or whatever. But that was more likely way back in the 1880s, 90s. In 1907, there was a earthquake that destroyed 90% of the buildings in Kingston. Yeah. And the hurricanes have been very destructive, but now they have ways of keeping those records through hurricanes, through fires, through earthquakes, etc. But back in the day, a lot of those records could have been destroyed by fires and because obviously, most of those books were just kept, in an office somewhere. They probably weren't even kept out of the sunshine. Who knows? Exactly. So this is why the Jesus Christ Church of Latter-day Saints actually photographed all of these records and keeps it on the familysearch.org website. And it's a good thing they did that, because we probably would have lost even more records.
Wow.
Well, I'm just so pleased to have had you on the show. Dania, I'm going to hand over to you because you've been waiting for 2 years to make the announcement about the next show.
No, I haven't. It's the following show. That's the 29th. Yeah, so the 22nd, we're going to be talking about Deborah Sampson, who, aka Robert Shirtliff. Now, if you notice, that's a male name. But Robert Shirtliff, she actually fought in the American Revolution as a man. So we're, going back to those women again who was just doing the thing and making it happen and making sure we were protected. And this woman, she fought. She had actual battles and everything. But I do want to thank you so much, Mr. Sweeney, for joining us and for just giving us all of this knowledge.
Yeah, just dropping knowledge nugget after knowledge nugget.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me.
If you want to hold on for a moment, we'd appreciate it.
Yeah, okay. I certainly will.
All right.
So until next week, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here. We wish you all the best for the rest of your Sunday.
Yes, thank you guys. See you later.
Bye-bye.